And today I wanted to cover a recap of the networking and content delivery services that we had at this year's re:Invent. So a quick introduction. My name is Omar Tabaka. I'm a solution architect here at AWS. I've been a part of the AWS team now for the last 3 years. And I'm also part of the networking specialty team. So nice to meet you all. So let's go ahead and jump into today's agenda. So this is going to be the agenda today. I'm going to cover the 3 new announcements in regards to networking and delivery content, right? The first one's going to cover a new announcement called Zonal Autoshift. And that announcement happened within our Route 53 application recovery controller service. I'm also going to cover mutual authentication for application load balancer. And then finally, the last announcement that we have in networking is external endpoints and testing of task states are now available within AWS Step Functions. So for a lot of these announcements, these are new features within services we have. So before I jump into the announcement, I'm going to cover the service at a high level. That way everyone's on the same page and also has an understanding of that networking service and what it does at a high level before I talk about the functionality that we covered at re:Invent. So let's go ahead and kick off this conversation, starting with Route 53 application recovery controller. And we're going to start that with this quote by the CTO of Amazon.com, Werner Vogel. And he famously says, everything fails all the time, right? And he's not saying this to scare you. He's just saying it to keep in mind that software and distributed systems are eventually going to fail because something can always go wrong. And that means we want to make sure that we plan for failure. And when we plan for failure and we think about resiliency, I like to show this model that we have over here to think about resiliency, right? So when we think about resiliency, you want to break it down into two different categories. You have disaster recovery and also high availability, right? So disaster recovery is more about recovering from a major incident that might cause an extended downtime. And high availability is about maintaining ongoing operation and minimizing any sort of impact that an unexpected disruption an unexpected disruption that happens to your environment, right? So when you think about a resiliency strategy, you want to combine both disaster recovery and also high availability to have the most robust and reliable system up in AWS. So that brings us to this service called the Route 53 Application Recovery Controller. And what this service does is it actually gives you insights into your applications and resources, and it lets you know whether or not these resources are ready to fail over into, right? Are these resources ready to handle traffic from either a failed AZ or even a failed on-premise data center? This service helps you coordinate recovery for your applications both across regions and also AZs, right? Availability zones. And it's going to make the ability to recover your application much more simpler by automating a lot of the manual steps that you're probably used to doing today. So right here, let me go ahead and walk through some of the components of this architecture before I talk about the use cases of Route 53 Application Recovery Controller. So right here, we have the AWS cloud, and within our environment, we have 2 regions. For those of you who aren't familiar with regions, just think of them as a distinct location around the world. So we have a region in US East 1 and also a region in US West 2. So we have an active standby model over here where we're sending all our production traffic to one region, and we have a standby region in case there is some sort of failure within this region or within one of the data centers within this region. We also have these zones called availability zones. As you can see, you see one called 1A, 1B. So we deploy our resources within these availability zones and think of each AZ as a distinct data center that has its own redundant powering, networking, and cooling. So the first use case of this recovery application controller is the readiness checks, right? So with the readiness checks, what it does is Amazon has a set of rules to perform readiness checks on our services to make sure that those services are up and running and ready to handle any sort of production traffic. Right, so in this case, we have readiness checks applied to our load balancer, our virtual machines, and also our DynamoDB database as well. Another functionality is also being able to coordinate failovers across multiple AWS regions. So it's easy to simplify routing controls. So think of it as an on-off switch, right? So if this region were to go down or some sort of failure were to occur, with the click of a button within the ARC service, right, the application recovery control service, you're able to actually shift all your traffic to the standby region. And then finally, being able to mitigate any sort of failures across AZs, right? It's not just failing over from region to region, but you can also automate the process of failing over from a failed AZ to an AZ that's properly running. And that brings us to the first announcement that we had from reInvent this year in regards to networking, which is zonal auto shift. So with zonal auto shift, you could automatically and also safely shift your workload traffic away from an AZ that AWS determines there's a failure there, right? So AWS is going to use our internal monitoring tools and metrics to detect any sort of potential or failures within an AZ and automatically shift the traffic for you. So over here, we have an example of our resources. Let's say we have an application running across 2 different data centers, right? 2 different AZs. Using AutoShift, let's say a data center were to go down for some reason, or whether that's some sort of flooding, a bad code deployment, whatever the reason may be, AWS is going to detect that AZ is down and automatically shift your data over to an AZ that's up and running. That way users won't actually realize what happened, right? It's going to shift the traffic automatically, and it's all automated for you. So that's the first announcement. The second announcement I want to touch up on is mutual authentication for application load balancer. So mutual authentication is also known as MTLS, right? So I know a lot of you are familiar with SSL TLS. So MTLS actually extends the security that's provided by TLS and provides mutual authentication between both the client and the server, right? So with TLS, you just had the server present its certificate to the client, and based off that, they're able to establish a secure connection and communicate between each other securely, right? So with MTLS, both the client and server both need to present their certificates to establish that secure connection and communication between the two. So MTLS is commonly used for business-to-business applications like online banking, automobile being the 2 main use cases that we've seen. There's obviously a bunch of other ones, just depending on your requirements of your organization and your application. And customers that have implemented mutual authentication in the past actually had to create it themselves, right? They had to implement it within their backend systems on their own, or use some sort of third-party solution to implement MTLS, right? So engineers had to build the functionality into their backend, update and rotate the certificates, and also update to the latest security patches as well, right? So by using mutual authentication with application load balancer, your load balancer is going to manage that client authentication to make sure that only trusted clients are communicating with your backend application. So this is going to overall simplify authentication management and also reduce the load on your applications because this authentication is going to occur at the application load balancer level. And then finally, the last announcement that we had in regards to networking and content delivery for reInvent was adding external endpoints and also testing of task states within AWS step functions. So let's go ahead and find out what step functions are before we dive deeper into these 2 announcements that we announced. So right here, we have a modern application in the cloud, right? In the middle, we have a Lambda function, right? These are stateless event-driven functions that exist in the cloud. But the issue with applications, right? There's not only one function, one entry point, one component. You're always going to have multiple functions, right? And a lot of times, these functions are all communicating with each other. And whether these functions are serverless or not, they tend to have databases. They also tend to have some sort of queues. And then also Lambda functions and applications usually need to connect to other servers, right? So this is what an actual modern serverless application might look like. So we need a service that's going to help us orchestrate and create some sort of logical workflow to help these functions, serverless, stateless functions communicate with each other. And that's where AWS step functions come into play. So step functions is a serverless orchestration service, and it's going to help you coordinate and sequence the AWS services like Lambda functions, S3, DynamoDB, and a handful of other services, and help them communicate and orchestrate them in a unified workflow, right? So within our state workflow, our state machine, we have a state, right? And this state, just think of a state as some sort of individual step or task that's needed. So you have states that perform different operations, like invoking a Lambda function, making an HTTP request, waiting for a specific amount of time, or even making a decision based on some sort of input. So once you define the steps and tasks, you could also define the sequence in which the states are executed, right? So it's going to outline how the input and output of one state is going to become the input of the next state, and it's going to create a logical flow for the overall process. So why orchestration, right? So these are different ways you could orchestrate and sequence your task, right? You could sequence them. You could set up a task, and if it fails, to retry it. You could select and run steps based on different data inputs. You could run them in parallel, right? There's different ways to execute your workflow within AWS step functions. So let's look at an example, right? Let's say we have an image processing workflow, and once our user uploads some sort of image, we want to make a thumbnail out of it. And we also want to identify the features from the images and then store the image data we collected into a database. So this is what a workflow using AWS step function workflow studio would look like, right? You have 8 state steps. The first one is extracting the image metadata, right? So once the image is uploaded, it's going to check the image type. If it's not supported, then it's not going to execute anything else. But if it is supported, it's going to execute this next function, this next task, and actually downsize the image using this function that we have here, and then also pulling the metadata from the image, like mountain, people, snow, and storing that in some sort of database or storage repository. So now that we know what step function tasks are, let's go into the new announcement from this year's re:Invent. And that is introducing HTTPS endpoints, right? So now with AWS step functions, you could use HTTPS endpoints to integrate third-party APIs and external services to your workflows, right? So with endpoints, it's going to give your developers an easier way to make calls to external APIs and also integrate with existing SaaS providers like Stripe for handling payments, GitHub for code collaboration, and then also Salesforce for sales and marketing insights, right? So before this launch, customers had to use Lambda function to call any external endpoints, and they also had to handle the authentication and any sort of errors they got directly from the code itself. You can use either any preferred HTTP method like GET or POST, and then also HTTPS endpoint uses Event Bridge connection to manage authentication credentials for the target that you have, right? This could be username, password, API key, and also OAuth. And Event Bridge connections also will leverage AWS Secrets Manager. And what this does is it's going to store your secrets outside of the state machine, which is going to reduce the risk of accidentally exposing your secrets in your logs or in your state machine definition. And then also to accelerate the feedback cycle, we also announced a new capability of being able to test the individual states within your workflow, right? So this new feature is going to let you test states independently from the execution of your overall workflow. This is going to be very useful for testing your endpoint configuration, and you could change the input and test different scenarios without the need to deploy your workflow or execute the whole workflow. So when you log into AWS step function workflow studio in our AWS console, and you select a specific state, you'll see this test state button up here in the top right. So now with these new features with step functions, it's never been easier to build state machines that could solve a wide variety of problems like payment flows, workflows with manual inputs, and also integrations into legacy systems, right? So now using AWS step function HTTPS endpoints, you could directly integrate with any popular platform out there, whether it's a payment platform, for example, to make sure your users' credit cards are only charged once, right? Errors are handled automatically. On top of that, you could also test this new integration even before you deploy the state machine using the new test state feature. And thank you. And my name is Omar Tabaka. I am part of the networking organization. So if anyone has any questions about these new announcements or any questions in general regarding AWS networking, always feel free to reach out. I'm happy to answer any questions.